Bhima Devi project started in 2017 with a workshop. And the workshop was archaeological planning and recording, the first workshop of batch 2017 at Speaking Archaeologically. I had been going to Bhima Devi for a very long time. And I had been visiting the site with all the previous sessions of the research wing almost every year by this point of time. So when Bhima Devi happened as a project, all it was supposed to be initially was an archaeological planning and recording workshop, which is something that we really wanted to do for the site. You see, the site of Bhima Devi is nothing but a dilapidated floor plan. And that floor plan had to be measured and recorded on a graph paper so that we understood as a group the importance of archaeological documentation. And that's essentially what I took this batch to do at the site. But little did I know that I will be pinned to that site for the next 6 months, at least actively, and then for the next 3 years, almost off and on, over and over again, with various small projects, all leading to the giant Hydra, which is the volume 3 of the Speaking Archaeologically journal now. Instrumental to this project was the kind of students that I had there. So of those students, one of them literally walks up to me after we'd done archaeological planning and says if I knew Hanuman Chalisa. Little did he know that I'd been reciting Hanuman Chalisa all my way up to the site that day, so that I had the strength to endure this new batch. And that's something that I personally just did all the time anyway. Every time I am meeting and greeting new people, I do have Hanuman Chalisa in autoplay in my head. So he comes to me and says, if I knew Hanuman Chalisa, I wanted to ask him which verse exactly did he want me to think about. To which he replies, Jug Sahasra Jojan Par Bhanu. And I had no idea what he was getting at. So he talked some fancy stuff about ancient Indian measurements that I had never heard of until this point in my life as an archaeologist. Just to let it out there, we don't know everything at the very outset. Sometimes we investigate and we find out more about things. So he said, if I knew anything about ancient Indian measurements and the Ayadi formula, I said, talk more sense, come back to me with the metric conversions of this. Once again, I did not know that that wasn't the first time I was going to stay awake till 3 in the morning with Bhima Devi flashing on my screen. The said student kept me awake with metric conversions and how the so-called Indian measurements actually converted into metric. And the rest is history. About a month later from that, we were in Shimla on a museum session, the first museum session for the said batch. And I had very wickedly kept the project deadline, the research paper submission deadline, on the day of the museum visit. Yet again, I was expecting a lot of sorry, ma'am, didn't happen, couldn't do it. Sorry, ma'am, we had to travel all the way and look for accommodation in Shimla, did not have the time to do it. Little did I know I will be faced with a 35-paged manuscript, which was to become one of the first complete papers in the Bhima Devi project. So these are the small episodes in my life that led to what I may define as the birth of Bhima Devi project, which was to engulf me. And now, before I ramble on, I am going to usher in the said student, which is Divyansh, who you are here to hear tonight. And Divyansh, in your own words, what led to the birth of Bhima Devi for you?
All right, and welcome to Wednesday Nights with Divyansh Thakur. And I'm glad you're all here. So first off, because I said I'd like this to be an informal session, before waxing poetic about the site, which I am going to do anyway. So without waxing poetic, I'd like the language of the session to be a mixture of Hindi and English, because it is informal and I don't think English is capable enough of expressing what I'd like. But so I was off to the site, and I was off to this new site that I didn't know much about, and for something that was called the erotic temple of northern India. This wasn't anything of great significance. There wasn't any grandeur, there wasn't nothing. So I went in, and on this side there were broken, in a mound of rubble, there were broken floor pans, this and that. Then the mission that we were given for the day was to measure it all out. And when we were measuring it, I thought about, would they be measuring in metric? Because I don't think there would be a metric system back then. Of course, there wasn't. And in my school days, those old articles that talk fancy about the Indian civilization, very with a typical right wing bent, or they talk great of Indian civilization like the Hanuman Chalisa measured the distance from the sun to the earth, and you will find about algebra in these and this and that. India discovered zero, this and that. So I had heard about this measurement and the yojan and this and that, and I thought, let's try that. And one thing led to another, this and that, and there we were, stumbling upon things, and then we had for the next 3 years. And I went off to the Punjab University Library, and I looked up. Punjab University Library has digital resources like ProQuest. ProQuest has the Times of India from, I think, 1835 onwards. So I just looked up Bhima Devi, I looked up some clues, found some sites, and one thing led to another, and that's how it all happened.
All right, then that was the birth of Bhima Devi as per two different people, both on the project. We would now want some questions. So I'm hoping you will have questions. I'm hoping you will have things that you want to ask specifically about the project, and we are happy to answer in whatever little way we can. So just to give you a brief overview of the site till this point, Bhima Devi is an 8th to 11th century temple located in Pinjore, which is in North Haryana. And it is a Gurjar Pratihar temple, or so has been alleged. We were to discover eventually during the course of this project that this wasn't the first site and this wasn't the last site. We were at the very beginning very, very happy with this discovery, because if you talk to the locals, the only thing they will tell you is the Pandavas made it in their Agyatwas, which is every site that you do not know a history about. Mostly, a lot of these sites, which are temple sites, and the Pandavas supposedly made them specifically in North India, turn out to be Gurjar Pratihara temples, which is yet another thing that we discovered later on. Almost all the sites that we discovered starting from this point in Pinjore, all the way up to Kashmir and Jammu, were all Gurjar Pratihara temples, incidentally. And we were very, very surprised with some of these. We had no idea these temples existed. We had no idea the Gurjar Pratihars had such an overwhelming polity, because I am going to sort of drift towards polity a little bit, because I sort of went on to look into the polity, the expansion, and the imperialism of the so-called Gurjar Pratihars, which we are not taught in history books. And it's a real shame. It's something that needs to be addressed. It's something that needs to be sort of taken up more, because they were an important dynasty, specifically with whatever was going on in North India. And to my surprise, when we started working on the project, I found out that nothing virtually had ever been written at any magnitude altogether about the Pratihars. There was information, agreed, but there was never really anything that was documented or made very, very widespread. Rather, this is not even a dynasty that you read about when you read about the origin of Rajputs. So when we started looking, there was just so many things. There were inscriptions, there were pillars, there were very, very important monuments that you go and see anyway, which can be attributed to this particular dynasty. And very little, unfortunately, was ever known about it. So we have given you some of the background, we've given you the location, and we've given you what monuments we are specifically talking about. Now we would love some questions to sort of flow in from your end so that we can probably take it further.
Hello, I think I'll go first.
Thank you. I thought nobody was going to.
No, I think the first question, which I think even the Tarak has posted in the chat, I had the same question about the measurement system. It would be great if we could know more about how you went about it. Also, this is not a technical question, but simply how were you able this is to Divyan specifically, how were you able to navigate such a site which was literally in shambles, if I have to say, and reconstruct the floor plans, come up with the measurements, the exact measurements very clearly. So what were the difficulties faced during this process? Because it would have been a very difficult task to reconstruct this whole site, which uh, even whose records were technically not there in existence that much. So yeah, that would be my question.
So the measurement part was fascinating. So I had mathematics in my 11th and 12th standard, and I also had advanced calculus and this and that in my first and second year. I started wondering about how this could have happened, how that could have happened. So the question of measurements is really fascinating. So the metric system was introduced in India in around 1957. I think it was April Fool's Day, 1957. Before that, there were multiple systems in the country. Uh, and there was also this question that whether there was a systemic continuity between the system of measurement that we had today and in Harappan times. And was there any architectural significance? Was it derived from the human body, this and that? And so the biggest problem was that which system of measurements do I follow? Because there are n number of textbooks that describe the same things, and there are the same measurements and different standards of the same measurements. Because if a measurement is derived from the human body, say my finger or my hand is a hust, then my hand could be bigger or smaller. So there were estimations that were given by various scholars, and we had to work with those constraints, and those were the lacunae. But we worked out, we found out things, and we found out the ratios, and whatever worked for the site was. So it was really fascinating how they did stuff back in the day. Right. So there was stuff. So there were different musings. Like there was the Dholavira unit. What is a Dholavira unit? There were people like Danino who had done work on the topic, and it was also something that was of a larger significance. So if I had said that the system was continuous from back in the day, then that would be a question of whether the Hadappans were Aryans and Aryan immigration and bigger things. So I had to narrow myself down to the particular site, and I found out how they built things. They used arithmetic progressions, they used geometric progressions to do that, and there were advanced mathematics for the time, and everything in the site is related philosophically. The measurements are related to the site philosophically and to the caste system. So, for instance, a Brahmin would have a different set of measurements than a Kshatriya would on the same site. So, and they have prescribed the measurements. And the beauty of Vastu Shastra and the beauty of system of measurements is that if you find a single building block, and you know the ratios, and you know the time period, and you know the type site, and you know the location, then you can reconstruct this site in its entirety. And that's the beauty of it. So this was something that we found in the due course, but yeah, that's all. And yeah, there was, and we first off we tried in the one site, and we thought, how can we ascertain things, this and that. Then we went off to this other site, the site of Rampur Jungi. And there's an interesting story about the site of Rampur Jungi. हाँ, साइट पे हम गए और एक बाबा जी नीचे, हम दो मंदिर थे, एक मंदिर हम नीचे गए और नीचे एक बाबा जी बैठे। तो बाबा जी से पूछा कि यहाँ पे कोई मंदिर था? बोला नहीं बेटा, यहाँ तो सब उठा के निकाल दिया है। तो हम बड़े दुखी होकर वहां से आ गए। दूसरी साइड पे जब हम गए, and we found the entire floor plan on the other side of the temple, and that was a eureka moment for us. And then I think you read my paper.
I think the whole measurement thing, if I'd like to add, we started off very, very basically, because like I said, the plan was कि एक archaeological plan बनाते हैं. We have to make a plan on a graph paper that we can record the site with. The idea behind it was monument recording. It was never writing about the monument or what the monument looked like. I mean, I'd never in a million years conceive something like, oh, let's take its measurements and see if we can sort of go bit by bit into reconstructing the whole temple. This was all his idea and never mine. One of the things that, like he said, was very, very unnerving was the whole caste system interplay in the ancient Indian measurement systems. So we had to be absolutely certain on who commissioned the temple. And you cannot have theories there. You cannot have something that you found from some book which says, okay, this might be the person. One of the most interesting things about Bhima Devi really is you do not know the commissioning king's name. So you know it was commissioned in the Gurjar Pratihar times, but at no point in time is there an inscription or anything. Like there were rumors of an inscription. There was a point of time when we were going through everything that Alexander Cunningham had first written in his Archaeological Survey of India volumes, because somebody had claimed in this very subsidiary book on Bhima Devi that Alexander Cunningham found an inscription inside. And for the longest time, Divyansh and I were literally rattling our brains about what this inscription could be. We came across a supposed inscription that was associated with the site, but we found out much later that that inscription was 5th century and our site was 8th to 11th century. So that's a very specific date line. Thankfully, we had a date line to go with. Thankfully, we also had a dynasty to go with. The said temple from before was a local temple in the Chandi Mandir cantonment area. The temple is now lost to time. Its sculptures are now in the Chandigarh Museum, and a lot of sculptures from Bhima Devi and associated sites in Pinjore are also in Chandigarh Museum, except they've never been provenanced. The only thing the provenance says is Pinjore, Haryana. It doesn't give you a dateline, it doesn't give you a site, it doesn't give you exact locations of it, which was very, very daunting, because when you have that kind of information and when you have a site of the magnitude of Bhima Devi and you start finding these small sister sites here, there and everywhere in the area, you just have to know what came from where. This was another thing that we found, because measurements never really work alone. So it's not just the floor measurement that will decide how tall the temple was, how high the temple was, or how wide the temple was. You also find out a lot of these things through Talaman, which is how much did the idols on the walls, how much did the pillar reliefs measure up to, what was each idol measuring up to, and let's say there were 5 Shiva idols, so how many talas were these made in? So that was yet another problem, because on the site, you have sculptures dumped from other sites. They're clearly dumped. We have pictures of sites, we have pictures of objects and reliefs which say Maharonwala, which is another site altogether. It's another temple site, also a sister site of this, but we do not know where it's located in Pinjore. That's something that we've been still trying to find out. There were certain objects from other temples that have also been dumped and put into the Bhima Devi site museum, which is yet another problem. It just compounds the problem of measurements. So, and for the floor plan, for the record, the floor plan has been reconstructed. So when this whole site was dug up, they accidentally ended up destroying the floor, the original temple floor, and they've now used concrete to sort of cement certain parts, which is why subsidiary shrines and their measurements became very, very important, because this is a Panch Yatna temple, which means it's in a quincunx pattern. There's one main shrine in the middle and there's small subsidiary shrines on the side. So we had 2 of these subsidiary shrines. One of them is completely truncated. The other one was slightly more intact. We were able to thankfully measure those and then come up with permutation combination of 2, what the main measurements would have been like. But to be absolutely sure, we will need original things. We will not need corruption of or contamination of samples on site, which is something that we were facing. But other than that, there were quite a lot of measurements to work with. There were quite a lot of formulas to work with. It was very, very daunting. Also picking up Rampur Jangi, I think Rampur Jangi was one of the sites which was very, very important in understanding what was going on in Bhima Devi. One, it is located along the same river. So you know exactly where it's located in the larger scheme of affairs. Both sites in Pinjore and both on the same bank, strictly speaking, of the river, and both 20 minutes away from each other. So if you had these sites located where they were, if this site had the kind of floor plan, and the floor plan was a treasure to find. If you go through the book, you will actually find the floor plan in the appendices, the floor plan at Rampur Jangi, because it was inscribed on one of the broken pillars. And the site has been totally modified. It's a modern temple now. They've used tiles, they've used plaster to cement over it. And interestingly, they happened to rescue this one pillar fragment that had nothing on it except that floor plan. And it's not very conspicuous. I still remember the day we went to Rampur Jangi. This is one of our favorite memories from the whole Bhima Devi project, because not only did it add so much to our knowledge, it also bonded us personally as people. So one of the most important things about this bonding that we formed because of this was, we go into the village, we knock through several doors, and Divyansh, coming from his anthropology background, goes on touching everybody's feet, talking sweet, talking nicely to them, picks up the lilt very, very quickly, starts talking in this weird Punjabi Haryanvi mixture of Hindi, and goes and talks to everybody and acts like he's this long lost child returning to the village and going like, yahan par auntie aisa hai, yahan par uncle aisa hai. And people loved him. The minute he walked into houses, I mean, there was this point where Priyanshu and I was just sitting and watching him do all of this, survey the whole site for this, survey the whole village for this one site, talking to random people, all of that. And we're just taking this in as to how he's taking out information from all these people. And he then leads us in the middle of the village to this very unleveled site. We were very, very happy because, when the land levels dip or rise sharply, so there's something that is unexcavated. There's some unfinished business here. So we go very, very excitedly. We find this horrendous temple, which has also been modernized. And after staying there for like 15 minutes, we finally locate the Baba or the priest there. And he goes, कि यहाँ पर तो जितना भी पुराना था वो हमने गंगा जी में बहा दिया, and that is it. We had no sculptures. We had nothing remaining on that site that could tell us more about it. And we were very, very disappointed because this was Thursday. I had infamously summoned these two from their class to the site, going, we are going site hunting today. We did not have anybody from the preliminary team. It was supposed to be this one little secret site visit, because if we found it, yay. If we didn't find it, then we were going to keep quiet about it. And also, in case of archaeological exploration, sometimes the more the merrier doesn't work. It's the more liability there is. So here we were, and we were looking for this temple, and we were very, very disappointed at this point of time. And I remember sinking to the floor in frustration, because it was like, okay, we have successfully ruined one day, which could be A, spent at the library doing something better, or B, spent somewhere else looking for a valid lead. And here we are in the middle of nowhere, and there's nothing here. There's nothing. We don't even have any provisions to, say, have lunch if we wanted to. That's how bad Rampur Jangi really was. And we're sitting there, and he comes up to me and goes like, we are going to find this temple. It has to be here. It's not this site, but it's somewhere here. We're leaving Rampur Jangi after 3 hours of exploration, and he suddenly goes like, let's stop the car here. Let's go to this modern temple just for the heck of it. And I still remember going like, see, I don't have the courage to walk into yet another place and find out this is not it. But he does. He just walks in. I'm like, you go. I'm just going to sit in the car. If there's something there, just beckon me. He goes in. For 10 odd minutes, we're just looking at the door, and he suddenly beckons you like this. And we literally rush to the site. And the first thing we see is this huge staircase on the side where they have all these medieval sculptures deposited. The most enormous and the most conspicuous among these is a Sukansa with Vishnu engraved on it. Very, very similar to the one that we have in Bhima Devi. So we knew that we had hit a jackpot right there. Stylistically, it was similar. In terms of what it was just the same thing. And then we took measurements of the Sukansa, because by that time we'd figured out if you measured the Sukansa, you technically knew how much the Garbhagriha would measure. So we took the measurements, and the measurements were incredibly similar to the Bhima Devi ones. And Divyansh hops onto this relatively high stair and is sifting through all this rubble because they've literally put all the rubble there. They haven't sorted it in a nice aesthetic way. They've just kept it there. He hops up, he starts sifting through the rubble. He's moved a few pillars here and a few things there. And suddenly goes like, "Oh, piche kya hai?" And it falls onto that pillar, which is full of dust. We were lucky to have brushes that day in my bag. We brush it open and all we see is the floor plan. And that was a huge, huge moment because it was exactly the kind of floor plan we'd been drawing. You know, when we were taking these measurements and we were looking at all these books, this was the kind of floor plan we'd been trying. This is exactly the floor plan that we were looking for. And we just needed to be sure that our floor plan was correct. So that added a lot of information to our knowledge. Luckily, a few months on, I think in May that year, a similar Gurjar Pratihara temple site was reported from
Uttar Pradesh.
and somebody sent in a lot of pictures through citizen archaeology. And on that temple also, you had the same floor plan. So we knew that they were inscribing floor plans on the pillar. Where exactly they did it for Bhima Devi is right now lost to us, but it was a very valid practice. We found them subsequently on a lot of other sites, the floor plan being etched on a pillar first before they went on to draw it. So I think we've talked enough about measurements, we've rambled on. So Divyansh, if you're still there, Anshika wants to know, was there any moment that felt like a dead end or moments when you felt down with respect to the entire project?
There were moments, of course. This reminds me of this one couplet that I read कि रेत काबिज थी, बहुत खामोश लगती थी नदी, पार करते वक्त ये जाना कि बहुत गहरी थी नदी. तो जब शुरू किया तब तो ये सोचा कि चलो हो जाएगा, देख लेंगे कैसे होगा, पर करते गए तो पता लगा काफी चीजें मुश्किल हैं. जैसे अभी ये रामपुर जंगी वाला इंसिडेंट हो गया, कुछ मिला कुछ नहीं मिला, पर जब भी कुछ मिला तो फिर वो मिलता ही गया. फिर एक चीज से दूसरी कड़ी से कड़ी जुड़ती गई. और there were much more moments of spark than there were dead ends. There were moments of sparks. There were sparks flying and we fuddled. How is this happening? There were more moments of sheer confusion and sheer joy than there were these dead ends. And we never felt down. क्योंकि एक बार जो फिर ठान लिया था कि अब ये साइड करनी है तो करनी. I think that answers your question.
Yes, I think there was this one moment I remember when Divyansh messages me, goes, "I'm frustrated," you know, and so is Priyanshu here. Because we did have moments when a lot of people were cancelling out on the project. We started this project as a team of 20 people. And at the end of it, we were just 3. So that can be very, very disheartening, you know, what happened to the rest of the 17. I think it shatters your confidence when you're running a project and when you are sitting with a team of people and telling them that, see, this could be the most important thing of our lives. This could be our most important contribution as archaeologists, and we have to make it count. That's just unfortunate. We wanted more people. We wanted this to be a collective project. We wanted it to be truly reaching out to a lot of people. A lot of people filled in who were not supposed to. A lot of people came in who were not supposed to be there. Our principal photographer was a guy who we'd never even in a million years thought we would find. And similarly for our illustrator also somebody who helped us do figures and maps and everything was this student from IIT Kanpur, the last person expected on that project because this is an economics student. So we had those moments and I think those felt like real dead ends. But what really counted was, like he said, we never, I think giving up was never an option. And every time one felt like it, the other would be like, go ahead. No, this doesn't end here. We can't let it go here. I think it was also with the manuscripts because at one point of time, we were juggling and actually flirting with the idea of making it into a book or leaving it at the journal base. And we had both the manuscripts ready. So the minute we hit yes, we would have gone with it. And fortunately or unfortunately, Corona hit us before everything else. And we were left with the manuscript which was actually the deciding point. And I remember again calling up Divyansh going, should we do it? Because we are authorized to publish. Why don't we publish it as our own project rather than give this to somebody else to publish? And I think that was yet another dead end that turned into an opportunity. So the whole project really was a lot of dead ends, each turning into an opportunity for all of us. So Devyani says, I would like to know more about how did you go about the whole architectural plans? Also, how did you cope up with damages on the site? Again, Devyansh.
I think you should answer that.
The
About the architectural plans and the damages.
I think architectural plans, Devyani, they went from being in metric system to being in the Indian system to, and then the new thing. And there were continuous revisits. One thing I would want to talk about here in terms of architectural plans is never rely on a single plan and never rely on a single measurement. Never rely on a single site visit. I mean, if we did, this project would have ended on 15th October 2017 itself. That would have been the first and the last day of the project. I think the sheer number of times that we went back to the site just to take measurements, and the sheer number of times that Priyanshu literally had me at my wits' end saying, I need to measure this again, was very, very overwhelming at first. But it was also incredibly useful because the more you measure it, there will always be human error. There will always be two people holding the tape. And, there will always be that error of maybe 1 meter or 1 centimeter or something, the way you're measuring it. So the more you measure it, the more accurate your plans become. And we were continuously doing that. At one point of time, everybody was individually also doing their plannings and then tallying whatever we have. There's this very famous picture from the Bhima Devi project, which is also on the Instagram these days, where Priyanshu is comparing two plans side by side. So there are two people who've actually made the plan, and she's actually comparing both measurements. Ki kiska sahi hai, kiska galat hai. If you look at the floor plan, the other night, Priyanshu and I were trying to find the original floor plan and the measurements in it. And this is after this whole thing has been published. Literally, while we are talking about it, we are still looking for plans and still looking at plans and going like, what does your measurement say for side A? What does your measurement say for side B? So there is no single way to cope up with it except being persistent. Similarly, for the damages also. The damages, it's very, very tempting to think because it's right next to the Mughal gardens. Very, very tempting to think, oh, the Muslims came along and they slashed the site. That's the only explanation that you will find in a lot of brochures about the site, which I personally believe is a load of hogwash, because it's not a site that is destroyed by somebody trying to get into the temple and loot things out. If you look at the kind of damages, they're literally either A, damaged over time, or B, they fell on their face. So they had some kind of natural calamity happening. And if you sort of trace it back to the 1905 earthquake, which happened much recently in time, I don't think something like that would not have happened in the past. Something that went unrecorded, something that led to mass destruction of these sites. Because at one point of time, we were also very, very fascinated with the idea that there are hardly any intact Gurjar Pratihara temples in this part of North India. Why? So you have them in Haryana, in South Haryana at least. You have them in Rajasthan, you have them in Madhya Pradesh, you have them in Uttar Pradesh, you even have them intact in Uttarakhand. So why is it exactly that all the Gurjar Pratihara temples between Himachal Pradesh and Jammu and Northern Haryana, which is where Pinjore is, how is it that only they got damaged? Why didn't the rest of these sites collapse? So I think one of the reasons is there was probably some kind of natural disaster. We were also looking at tectonic data or tectonic history of the area at the time that we were doing the geology and geographical history. So damages, and I strictly speak from the sculptural point of view because I was constantly occupied with analyzing sculptures and doing object analysis. Not a lot of these sculptures are damaged because of intentional damage. A lot of these sculptures are naturally damaged. They're environmentally damaged. They are corroded because they're made of sandstone and they've been left to exposure to acidic soil, or because of rainwater. They have biodeterioration, very clear indication of biodeterioration and fungal formations. There's a big lichen mat on one of the most prominent sukansas on site, which is very, very important, which would have been the entering sukansa. I am inclined to believe that you enter the temple site from the south. That's where it was, because if you look at the lintel, the damage on the door lintel is the same kind of damage on everything that would have been organically located in the south. So again, bringing in Vastu Shastra there, Vastu Shastra divides your whole site into cardinal and ordinal directions. And they were so meticulous about these cardinal and ordinal directions that certain figurines had to be located in the north, and then certain figurines had to be located in the south. More often than not, if the temple was located to a single deity, the figurine on the north would be the counterpart, because every person has an avatar, every deity has an avatar in Hinduism. So the Soumya avatar, let's say, would be on the north end. So the Rodra aspect of the same deity would be on the south end. And if you look at all of these with Bhima, with respect to Bhima Devi, the Nadan sculptures are incredibly intact. The Ishan figurines, the Varun figurines, all of these are incredibly intact. The Ishan panels are impeccably well preserved, which means they did not collapse until a very long time. We also interviewed a local there, and a lot of locals actually told us that when this site was first rediscovered in 1970s, literally all there was here was a big hill. Now, if you go by the popular theory, which is the Muslims came and destroyed the site, how did the temple get buried into a hill? That cannot have been possible, because then there would have been rubble lying here and there. Agreed, some of the rubble from the site is actually found in the Mughal gardens, but that was probably a lot of surface stuff, a lot of surface pillars, and they're not that big. They're hardly that big, which have been put into the Mughal gardens. That could have been done at any point of time, because the Mughal gardens were then claimed by King Yadavendra, and the whole palace is now known as Yadavendra Palace or Yadavendra Gardens, because he reconstructed and refurbished it in his time. So a lot of these things that have now gone into the main Pinjore Gardens didn't really happen because somebody came and demolished the temple to create their own palace. Otherwise, all these columns would have been there, all the big pillars would have been there, or the bharavahaks, the small columns that you have, which lift the pillar up, that give you the illusion of a man lifting a pillar up. Usually it's kichak. All of these are also incredibly intact. And the only explanation is anything that was towards the north or the northeastern end of the temple has survived because it was probably standing erect, got buried into the mound, and was later excavated in such a situation that it led to the collapse of whatever was remaining of the site. But whatever was to the site, was to the south side, had already fallen flat on its face, which is why it's deeply corroded, deeply damaged, and you can't even see the features in some of them. So I think that's a very longish explanation to that. I'll take up the next question. Simran says, I also wanted to know, how did you deal with sculptures whose iconography and museum identification were increasingly confusing? For example, Ishan Varun sculpture that we discussed on the Speaking Archaeologically page recently. Again, my question, not Divyanshu's. So with difficulty, I think the Ishan Varun controversy is something I will never get over, because I am convinced that this is not Varun, it's Ishan. But every person of importance with respect to Indian iconography tells me otherwise. They tell me it's Varun and not Ishan. Now, my argument to it being Ishan is Ishan will have something like a goat or a deer or anything that looks like this as his Vahan. Whereas Varun would very, very evidently have a makar or a crocodile at the bottom. And it's only after we posted, and this is very, very funny because I removed that particular section from my development of Shaivite sculptures section. And I went like, okay, theek hai, Varun hai, fine. Everybody is saying it, including Dr. Kumud Kanetkar. She's also calling it Varun. So, it's her experience and her knowledge of iconography over mine. I've only just started. I just have the last 10, 12 years of experience. She has much longer than that. So who am I to contradict it? So I was like, okay, fine, I concede. This is probably Varun. And because I probably don't know much about this, it could be Varun. But it only occurred to me after that whole Instagram debate on it that there are two ends to the sculpture. They both look like the same male deity standing, but technically the one on the right has a makar at the bottom, and the one on the left actually just has that. And if I would put it in the temple column in such a way that one was facing east and the other one was naturally facing the western side of the temple, then that makes perfect sense. because that's where they would be located. And that's something that I have now included in the chapter, in the last chapter, where what sculpture would be located. So with things with increasing confusion with respect to iconography, we've given up sometimes, and we have then probably delved deeper into it, because there's no giving up. There was this one sculpture that always fascinated us. It's now located to the north of the site, but it was probably a southern sculpture because looking at the damage, which was this man standing, and all you see is flames behind him. You do not see his ayodhas. You can't tell how many hands he has. You see something like a dog perhaps at the bottom of his feet, but you can't be sure. And it has no discernible features at all. It's been worn smooth from the front. So we would always assume that this is something, and God knows what this is. And it looked a lot like, there was this person on site in the preliminary team, who was Jen, Devyansh's friend Akhil, who said that this could probably be a Parsavnath, which I wasn't ready to buy, because why would you have a Jain figurine? He counter-argued with how there were Jain figurines on the site which were dumped on the site. So maybe this was dumped on the site. But it doesn't look likely. It doesn't look like it has been dumped on the site. It looks very much like it was always a part of this. It's made of the same material. It looks exactly like everything else. It's just worn smooth. So it's very, very recently that I realized this could be one of the Aghor aspects of Shiva, because it would be located to the south, since this was a south entering temple. Also, one of the things we know about the temple is its name, which is Bhima Devi. And Bhima is actually the Raudra roop of Shiv, the Aghor roop of Shiv. So A, it's a tantric site. It has tantric art. B, it's a Shaivite site predominantly. And C, it's continuously dealing in sculptures that have the Raudra and the Soumya aspects of Shiv. There's so many other things. There's the Mahakal Sukans, where you have a very gory looking Shiva in the middle and two skulls on his either side. So very, very scary to look at. There are a lot of Bhadras, Bhadramukh Shiv sculptures where he's very, very angry. He's visibly seeking to destroy. You look at the sculpture, you look at its expression, whatever's remaining of it, it becomes very clear to you that this is a site which was primarily dedicated to the angry Shiva. It was never really dedicated to the Soumya Shiva. So it's just then that I realized that this could be Bhairav, because Bhairav has flames behind him and his Vahan is a dog. And this, I mean, if the Ayodhas were surviving, we could be very, very sure of it. But it's probably, most probably, a Bhairav sculpture. So, Ira says, why is the temple called Khajuraho of the North? Is it because of architecture or iconography? No, it's only because of the erotic sculptures. They just wanted to create some hype about it, and they lost all enthusiasm. Devyansh, do you have something to add to that?
There was also the fact that it was a tantric temple, and that the Gurjar Pratihars, the Chandel rulers, were the feudatories of the Gurjar Pratihars. So they made that connection.
So Simran says, how vital a role did you think local community played in this project? Especially after having listened to the story of Baba that you just narrated. Devyansh will take this up, please.
Well, the local community was, how do I put it nicely? They were indifferent. The people on the site who were handling things were not interested in the site, and they trusted the stories that the site was built by the Pandavas, like any other site in North India. You go to Masroor, you go to sites that were built in 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, 10th century, 12th century, and they'll say it was built by the Pandavas. So that's that. But the local community were essential in telling us how things turned out, because they told us that यहाँ पे एक बिजली गिरी थी और ये माउंट टूट गया और ये पेड़ गिर गए और this and that. They helped us out as much as they can. Locations उन्होंने बताई, but I can't say कि अब जैसे उन बाबा की बात करें तो Baba was more interested in being published in the papers with his interview. The local community, to be very honest, was indifferent about the site.
I think adding to that, they were very, very important in our understanding of what was going on, because we had this whole ASI report that said the site was excavated. And we were very confused as to where were these excavation reports. I mean, there's this 1974 Gazetteer of Archaeological Survey of India which says the site has been excavated, but that's a one-line report. So where is the complete report for it? So we looked everywhere, and at a lot of these times that we were looking for these reports, the local people had us running in circles. One person on site who helped us find, who actually told us that hua kuch bhi nahi tha. There was this one storm here. There used to be an aam ka ped on top of this mound. The aam ka ped fell, and along with it, in its roots, came this huge sculpture. And that's when we realized there's something inside. So the minute people found out, they started digging it. The minute they started digging it, they found these erotic sculptures coming out, hence the name Khajuraho of the North. And then the archaeologists came in for maybe about a year or so, and that was it. Local community does nothing about promoting it. It's only after we started visiting this site every single Sunday of our lives since 2017 that they've now started charging a ticket about it, which we find very hilarious. We find it very, very amusing. But yeah, local community, they only started noticing it. There were pre-wedding shoots the last time we went on the site, and we were wondering where the hell did people come here from. That's because the site is heavily encroached also. So a lot of people's backyards open onto the site. And they saw these bunch of students sort of going through the site every single week, and they got interested कि यहाँ पर ऐसा क्या है जो ये आ रहा है. So that's the local community for you. They only started noticing it because we were frequenting it so much. They would always wonder why we would get there at 10 in the morning and not leave till 8 p.m. at night. All right, so Diptarak says there's a lot of stuff that comes up on social media, WhatsApp, and I think also in some published literature that sort of glorifies Gurjar Pratihars and the majestic architecture in superlatives only. However, these are not critical analyses of either the dynasty or the architecture. In that context, what kind of reaction do you expect to your book? And how did the task of referring the sources work? Were enough of critical studies available, or did it all start from absolute scratch?
There were not enough critical studies available. There was this one study on most of our sources were based on primary sources. So we found out about the site through newspapers. There were more newspaper cuttings than there was work done on the site. So I think we had the bare bones only. So we had a book on sculptures in Haryana and a book on Gurjar Pratihar art and architecture, and that was about it. And we were left to our own devices. So there were not enough critical studies in the region. I'd like to link it up with the question that Medha asked, that how were you guys able to trace the sister sites? So we found out when we were looking at the geography, we found out that the building material, that the sandstone in the region was not strong enough to hold the building. So we couldn't build such a magnificent structure with those kinds of sandstone. So the sandstone was transported to the site from the Kasoli range via the river, that is the Ghaggar river. So any temple that comes up should be along the Nala or along the river because of the transportation of the raw material. So we found out about the site of Rampur Janki just because in the newspapers, and then we corroborated it with the evidence, and we found out that all the sister sites are located along the river or along the Nala or the Cho. So that was surprising, and we found out about this in, I think it was the Punjab District Census Handbook, which was published by the British back in the 19th century, I think.
The 19th century.
The British were of the opinion that the sandstone, the building material to the site was transported from the Kasoli range. And the local author that we studied about Haryana sculptures, he said that the building material was locally available, readily available, which was not the case. So that was the kind of material that was available.
There are no pre-excavation, post-excavation pictures of the site available. Like I said, there's no preliminary site report. There are trees that are planted right over the subsidiary shrine. And what happens is, when you supposedly in that beautification process, when you plant a tree on existing archaeological body, what will it do? The roots will capture whatever's underneath. In case the tree falls, everything that it has captured will fall with it. And the minute that happens, it's only a matter of years, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, but the tree will fall. and the archaeology underneath will be disturbed. So the subsequent scope of excavation has also been ruined in the case of Bhima Devi. There is stuff that is yet to be excavated. There are areas, there are very, very clear mounds on Bhima Devi, which show that there is archaeological material underneath. The level is incredibly unleveled. It's slightly higher somewhere, it's slightly lower somewhere. Wherever it's higher, there is a chance there's something there underneath. Okay, Alina says, is the architecture of Bhima Devi temple suited to prevent or reduce damage from seismic activity or natural disasters in that region? Does it employ techniques which have still survived in the area by any chance, Divyansh?
I don't think they built it to be. It was built. I don't think that they thought that they build it with constraints of tectonic activity and this and that. I'm not sure. I can't answer you on that one. But it's built with sandstone, and about the techniques which have still survived in the area by chance. No, they aren't. The modern construction is all brick, and it's sandstone, and you carve. It's masonry and sandstone work, and the sandstone is carried all the way from Kasoli, which is not feasible for the common man. And no, we don't do masonry anymore. We do brickwork. That too modern brickwork. It's not, the Nanak Shahi bricks are not used anymore. Well, there's nothing, not the regular techniques which have survived. No.
So Stavera says that he's still an amateur. That's perfectly fine. I visited Facebook page to check the idol. Mukut looks like Jat Mukut, and doesn't that prove that it's not Varun and indeed Bhairav aspect Ishan? That's another point that I do have with respect to it. But we also had 5 different sources, 5 different books saying the same idol with the picture of the idol, which they managed to take, saying yes, no, this is Varun. And then we had this on authority by a lot of other iconographists who said, no, this is Varun. And I still refuse to believe it. To me, it's Ishan. But like I said, I would want to investigate more on that sculpture. Also, I would like to believe that because there are 2 ends to that sculpture, it's really a cuboid with one sculpture on one end, the other sculpture on the other end, and the backward side, the side at the behind, is completely plain. There's no carving on it. So if I look at it with respect to temple architecture, perhaps it would fit in a column like that. We have one side where Ishan needs to flank the main deity, and we have the other side that Varun needs to flank the main deity. That makes perfect sense. Varun is the god of West. Ishan is the god of Northeast. So that makes sense. You would have Ishan on one side and Varun on the other. Using just one of those faces to say that this is an Ishan figure only, or saying that this is a Varun figure only, is slightly flawed as an approach. And that's something that I would want to take up again, perhaps in a future research paper or in a future work. What was, if you were to talk about sister sites, what do you think was more important to you as a find? Which sister site do you think was more critical to your understanding of Bhima Devi? Because we talk about a lot of them. We talk about Bilvakeshwar in Kathua, we talk about Krimchi temples, we talk about Masarur.
Rampur Jangi, because of the measurements and because of the flow plan, and because of the emotional experience attached to it as well, because it was a difficult find, and yes, because of the floor plan and because the parallels were, how do I put it? The parallels were stark. That's why Rampur Jangi. That's it.
No, I think I definitely second that. I think because Rampur Jangi was emotionally one of the best experiences we've had as a team. Until Rampur Jangi happened for me personally, I think we were just a pair of people working together. That's all we were. And then Rampur Jangi happens, and then it was suddenly transforming into a unit. And if Rampur Jangi wouldn't have happened, I think we wouldn't have had the kind of other experiences that we had with respect to working on the project. So one of the most difficult experiences for you, like overall in terms of site work and in terms of whatever you did, what was difficult for you generally?
I think there weren't many difficult moments. There were moments which were more pleasurable. The detective work was pleasurable, but I found the writing part, when I had to write and rewrite the paper and to expand and then contract and then to include the references and delete references. The detective work was the nicer part, and it was rougher when it came to writing. It's always rougher when it comes to writing because my writing skills are not. I'm not very good at writing fast.
Personally, the most rewarding experience for you?
Learning how to write elaborative sentences with commas.
Thanks. So, I think what will be your one takeaway from Bhima Devi? That's my last question. I think if there are no more questions, we'll like to end this with it. So, your takeaway from Bhima Devi?
My takeaway from Bhima Devi would be the kind of work ethic. The indifference that I had was the veil of indifference that I had put over my face was uncovered, and I found relationships. I found you on the site, and I found all the other wonderful
Thank you.
people that I worked. And that's all. That's all I'd like to say. It was wonderful working on the site, and it was a mind-boggling and a mind-opening experience.
So, once again, thank you very much for joining in tonight and listening to us about Bhima Devi. I think that would be it. So, thank you guys.